Hello, ladies and gents. This is Mr. Windsor speaking. Last topic, you were talking about the Stuarts with the lovely and talented Mr. Barlow. This topic, we are going to be talking about the Reformation, King Charles II, discovery of the New World. That's North America and South America to you and me, and all the events that before and after that. So I realised I may not have met some of you before. You may have seen me in and around the school. My name is Mr. Windsor. I can be characterised by messy, spiky brown hair and a pair of glasses and usually a scruffy beard. Chances are you've probably seen me around, even if we haven't met personally or said hello to each other or greeted each other personally. So I'm going to be guiding you through the next little bit of lessons together, and sure enough, you become more than accustomed to my voice over the course of the next few lessons. So let's get started then with the introductions done. Let's begin. So let's think about what we already know. As I said, Mr. Barlow was looking after you for the previous sequence of lessons, and I'd like you guys to write down as much as you know. Now, if you've got your booklet, that's brilliant, or perhaps you might want to use a spare piece of paper for this task. Create 3 columns for me. The columns are labeled people, places, and events, and I just want you to summarize and review and write down as many people you can think of from the previous topic, places from the previous topic of the Stuarts, and notable events in the previous topic as well. We'll go through this together as a group. Please give yourselves a few minutes in order to try that and get another coloured pen ready to write in some answers that you did not know before. Right, okay, so let's figure out what we already know then. Okay, so let's talk about people first. So we have the Roundheads. These were the soldiers and the army that were on the side of Parliament in the English Civil War. They were given this name due to the typical shape of the helmets that they wore. They were, of course, round. They were very, very well trained and relentlessly drilled. And in fact, they were far more effective soldiers, if you're to believe the writing, than the Cavaliers were, who were the Royalists. Word is that the Cavaliers weren't particularly well trained and often were defeated by the more well trained parliamentarian Roundheads. So King James in the previous topic. Later on, when the New World is founded during the reign of King James, they call the first town in America, you guessed it, Jamestown. That's something that we will come back to later on in this scheme of work. He was a Protestant. We know from previous monarchs that there's a bit of a religious roller coaster going on. It goes usually between the 2 different types of Christianity, of Catholicism and Protestantism. Catholicism was a bit more ornate, a bit more decorative, a bit more. They had very, very large cathedrals, whereas Protestantism did away with all the extravagant trappings of the Catholics and worshipped in a very simple and humble way. We had Charles I, who was the previous king. Eventually, he was executed in January. It is said that he wore 2 shirts because it was a cold day and he didn't want the crowd mistaking his coldness for fear. We had Oliver Cromwell, who ousted King Charles I. He took over power as a Lord Protector of England. Many of you will say, well, that's just a king under a different name, sir. And in many ways, I suppose you're right. However, when they offered him the title of king, he refused. But in many ways, I suppose you could say Lord Protector was pretty much the role of a king, just given a different name. We also had the New Model Army, which is the name of the army of Roundheads that were on the side of Parliament. So places. So Parliament is a building in which the British government will meet to discuss various issues. MPs, they still use the same building. The MPs go in there to debate various issues and laws being put into place. I suppose Parliament can also refer to a group of people. You can say Parliament to refer to a group of politicians as well. Carisbrooke Castle is the place where Charles I was held prior to his execution. The Gunpowder Plot, Guy Fawkes and some conspirators, or perhaps it was a stitch-up and they were the victims of a stitch-up, tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament with the king inside. In fact, the mask of Guy Fawkes is still used today by groups such as Anonymous, who were a group of hackers who tried to disrupt the government computer systems and stuff like that. And also it's used quite frequently in anti-government protests. And so that this is why they used anti-government protests, because Guy Fawkes, the guy whose face this mask is based off, was anti-government. We also had the English Civil War between the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. We also had the Battle of Marston Moor, one of the largest battles in the English Civil War. And we also had the Battle of Naseby, another bloody and hard-fought battle in the English Civil War between the Roundheads and the Cavaliers. Furthermore, as briefly stated before, we also had the execution of King Charles I. After this point, Cromwell becomes Lord Protector of Britain. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about in this lesson? And we're talking about something called the restoration. So the restoration is when you restore something to its former state. So you might find a broken down old house in the middle of nowhere, and you will restore that house to its former glory. So we use this word because Britain is restored from being from Cromwell being in charge as Lord Protector to being a monarchy. So restored in quote marks to its former glory. We're going to be using some contextual information, so information that gives us a bit of knowledge about that time. Why? We're going to see whether or not people were in favour of having a monarch back, a king back, or if they preferred life under Lord Protector Cromwell. Okay, so Cromwell. Let's get a little bit more information about Cromwell. Cromwell is what we call a Puritan. He believed that religion should be in its simplest form, and people should just be content with worshipping God in small and humble ways, rather than in the massive cathedrals that pulled in hundreds of thousands of pounds per year, like the Catholics did. Loads of religious idols and gold. And Cromwell, I believe, looked on the Catholics and thought, this isn't what God would want. God is happy with small acts of worship of decent, sinless people who don't engage in things like sex outside of marriage, gambling, too much frivolous activity like going to see plays or entertainment. They should just be happy with their lot in life and worship the God that gave them that life. So he was quite a remarkable man. He seemed to be torn into two directions a lot of the time. He wanted good Protestants to be free to worship the God the way that they thought was right. He did not force people to go to the Church of England services every Sunday, the way that Charles I had done. On the other hand, he was extremely tough towards those he felt might have been a threat to the Protestant Church of England. So again, he was very anti-Catholicism, very pro-Protestantism. He and many other Puritans, who were Protestants who wanted a simple and strict religious life, wanted to make England more godly, wanted to make it more religious, more holy. By this, they wanted the population to be religious, to have good manners, to be sober, avoid getting drunk, avoid rowdy entertainments like plays and sport and so on. This proved deeply unpopular with many ordinary people. The only way these people could kind of get away from the drudgery of their normal everyday lives was by engaging in gambling, going to see plays, going to get drunk down at the pub, gambling in the streets. And so when these things were taken away from the English public, a lot of people were very, very upset. It is one reason why Cromwell had a reputation as a miserable person, when in fact Cromwell likes a good joke. Yeah, we do have this perception of Cromwell as a bit of a stick in the mud, but apparently he wasn't just that. Cromwell believed the importance of Parliament and tried hard to work with MPs, unlike previous kings. On the other hand, he dismissed Parliament twice during his rule and often argued with MPs. So he did want to listen to Parliament, but at the same time, he had the power to totally dissolve Parliament and not pay attention to them at all. So how was he any different, really, from kings that had come before? Cromwell's power rested on the support of the army, and he wanted to work with Parliament to pass laws. The only problem is that when Cromwell tried to keep the MPs and the army happy, the MPs and army often disagreed with each other. So he was stuck in the middle of these two very powerful factions, the politicians of the country on one side and the army on the other side, who were tasked with backing up the law. MPs disliked the army and high taxes needed to pay for it. The leaders of the army tended to be political and religious radicals who held extreme views. They distrusted the MPs, many of whom would have put Charles I back in power after the First Civil War. Cromwell was as powerful as a king, yet when he was offered the throne in 1657, he refused to take it. But a lot of you are probably saying, well, sir, all this information you just given me, Cromwell basically was a king, just with a different name. That's a very valid view to have. Okay, so what's happened in the story so far? We know the winner of the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, died on the 3rd of September 1658. He was given an expensive funeral and buried in Westminster Abbey. Cromwell's son Richard was given his father's job as Lord Protector, but he was unpopular with the army generals and was fired in 1659, again showing us just how powerful the army is. They were able to fire their own leaders if they disagreed with him enough. Parliament needed someone to run the country. Who better to pick up from where we left off? Since Cromwell's son did such a terrible job, who better to pick up the job than Charles II, the son of Charles I? Charles II promised he would be a good king and did not want revenge for the death of his father. This was good enough for Parliament, and on the 29th of May 1659, Charles II was crowned. England was ruled by a king again. Long live this king. So this is what we're going to call the Restoration. So the king, the idea of monarchy, having a king, was restored in Britain. It was put back in its rightful place. So no more of this Lord Protector nonsense. We're going to have a monarch again. He's been restored to the throne in the Restoration. However, Charles II said he wouldn't want revenge for what happened to his father, but let's see if that's true. However, Charles II removed Cromwell's body from its grave and had it hung like a common criminal. He then took Cromwell's head and set it on a spike. This was a punishment usually reserved for the lowest of the low, the worst criminals in the land. It was not just Cromwell's body that was attacked, so were his character and his record as a ruler. So he didn't just destroy his now probably quite disintegrated body, but also attack the things that he did in his rulership and his character, saying that he was a bad man. Many of the historical sources about Cromwell were written by people who knew Cromwell before 1660, but wrote after 1660 and had personal reasons to criticise him. So after 1660, King Charles II is in power, and while King Charles II is in power, it means that they are probably going to write things that are very positive of King Charles II and very, very negative of Cromwell in order to remain in his favour. This means we have to be very careful about what the sources from this period said about both Cromwell and King Charles II. Okay, so King Charles made a few promises at something called the Declaration of Breda. A declaration is just another word for an announcement. He said, I promise that anyone who has bought land can keep it. I promise to pay the army. I promise that I will forgive people for their past mistakes. I promise that I will keep Parliament. I promise to allow religious freedom. So we've perhaps seen already this lesson that number 3, not necessarily something that King Charles II is very good at. I promise that I will keep Parliament. Well, we know that his father had a bit of a track record for not obeying Parliament, or not keeping to the advice of Parliament, and also Cromwell had the ability to dissolve Parliament as well. And promise to allow religious freedom. That sounds like a pretty good one. Okay, so very, very quickly, it's going to be a 2 or 3 minute task. Which of the 5 promises given at the Declaration of Breda do you think would be the most difficult to keep, and why? So given the track record of King Charles, either the second or the first, the nature of monarchy as a whole, think about which one of these you think would be most difficult to keep. You may want to rate them 1 to 5 in order of how difficult they may be to keep, 1 being the hardest. Think back on the Stuarts topic with Mr. Barlow. Has there been any trouble before? How would this affect being able to fulfill those promises? So have a little think. Sentence starter I might want to use is, I think that promise number 1, 2, 3, or 5 would be the most difficult to keep because. Okay, give that a go. Okay, so let's get some ideas on these 5 promises ready. I promise that I'll bought land. Anyone who's bought land can keep it. I promise to pay the army. Well, the new model army was made in about 1645 in response to Parliament needing an army. Now, after King Charles II was restored to the throne in about 1660, the new model army was disbanded. And so this second promise perhaps is a bit of a dud. Number 3, I promise that I will forgive people for their past mistakes. Well, I know Cromwell had died and everything, but even so, his treatment of Cromwell's body was pretty extreme. It smacks to me as someone who holds a bit of a grudge. I promise that I will keep Parliament. Okay, well, the thing is, yes, you can keep Parliament as an institution or keep it physically existing or MPs physically in there debating laws and whatever, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the king has to obey the advice given by Parliament. So, yeah, that's all well and good, but again, a bit provisional. I promise to allow religious freedom. This is quite a good one, actually, because we know that religion in Britain has been a bit of a religious roller coaster, with each monarch tends to alternate between Catholicism and Protestantism. And so, if King Charles passes the law that both Protestants and Catholics are able to practice their own brand of Christianity, that can only be a good thing for English society. Okay, so time for a bit more of an independent task, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to take us a bit of time because it involves a bit of creativity. You will have this in your booklet, or if not, you can just use a sheet of lined or spare paper, which is absolutely fine. Create a pamphlet giving information to the people of England during 1600. So people would need to know a little bit of information about, first of all, who was in charge before, who's in charge now, and what happened between those two things happening. So what I'd like you to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to create a pamphlet, which I suppose in modern terms would be more like a flyer or a leaflet or something like that. Giving following pieces of information as a success criteria. Who is the new ruler? Who came before? When were they crowned king? What promises have been made? Why are those promises exciting for the British public? So you can talk about the Declaration of Breda here. We can talk about why each of these promises would be a positive thing in the perception of the English public. You've got about 10-15 minutes to give that a go. You may need more time, in which case please do take it. Okay, so let us move on. King Charles II was restored to the throne on the 29th of May 1660, which was known as the Reformation, reforming something, or the Restoration as well. The people of England were very happy to have a monarch, a king in this case, back. But why were they so happy? So over here on the right-hand side, this is still from Horrible Histories, one of my favourite TV shows, where they do a great song called "The King of Bling." King Charles II, he was known as something called the Merry Monarch, and I'm going to go over why he was considered that in just a moment. So this, on the left-hand side of my screen here, this was life under Cromwell. We know that Cromwell was something called a Puritan. He believed that life should be as simple as possible in order so that people weren't tempted to sin and commit crimes and commit things that are against the Bible, such as gambling, having sex with someone who wasn't your wife or husband, going down the pub and getting drunk, playing sports apparently made people far too merry, and it meant that if they were having too much fun, then they weren't focusing on worshipping God. He also outlawed Christmas, believe it or not, because he believed that the celebration of God and Jesus should be more low-key than this massive festival that everyone had. So life under Cromwell, the army confiscated all roast geese at Christmas. Amazing. Pubs and taverns were banned. Can you imagine the amount of uproar in modern Britain if that were to happen now? Women were not allowed to wear makeup. If you were to wear makeup, that might make that woman a little bit too attractive to other men, which may cause things like affairs and having sex outside of marriage. People were not allowed to go to the theatre. There was a big downplay of entertainment at this time. So theatre, gambling, pubs, that sort of stuff. It was against the law to go to church on Christmas Day. However, in a stark contrast to that, let's see what King Charles did. He introduced champagne into Britain. Champagne, for those of you who don't know, is a very posh, bubbly white wine drink that you can only get from certain parts of France. If it's not from a certain part of France, you can't call it champagne. You can call it only sparkling white wine. So very, very nice. And this became popular. The richest and poshest people in Britain at this time, the aristocracy. Charles reopened the theatres and playhouses so people could be entertained again. Charles raced his yachts down the River Thames, sparking an interest in sailing. We still do this as well. We have boat races down the Thames. It's usually a race between Oxford and Cambridge. Charles declares that any laws that had been passed between 1949 and 1660 under Cromwell were illegal and they were to be repealed or got rid of. Charles reopened taverns and pubs. Drinking was no longer forbidden. Gambling was widely available again for all. King Charles himself was a fan of horse racing, where he could put down large bets and win lots of money, and card games. A lot of gambling was also dice based as well. Christmas celebrations were brought back, and people were allowed to play sports again. Uh, this last point, number 8, actually, this is good because around I read the other day that football is going to start up again because of the coronavirus crisis. Everyone has had to stop playing football, and now we're getting the Premier League back. Yay, lovely. Okay, so these are the things that happened under Cromwell, and these are the things that happened under King Charles II. I'm a bit of a cynical person, as you'll come to know about me. All of these things that King Charles did, yeah, really, really great, fantastic, make life more fun and everything. But how much of that is to get the favour of the people, to make himself popular, and therefore add to his power? You have to wonder. Maybe he just did these things to get the people on side. Maybe he doesn't care about the people at all. Okay, so let's start wrapping up our inquiry about the Restoration and King Charles II, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so we looked at some of the things that Cromwell put into place and some of the things that King Charles II put into place. First of all, I'd like you to try this task in the bottom left-hand corner. Would you rather live in London during the time of Cromwell or Charles II? I'm fairly sure I know which way you guys are going to lean on that one. But please give examples using this information on this page. Otherwise, it's not a very full answer. Give yourself a chance to do that. And let's do a little bit more of reviewing. Explain why many people in England were happy to have a king again. Many English people celebrated in 1660. Oliver Cromwell had died and the monarchy was restored in England. One reason people were happy was this made people happy because. Another reason people were happy was this made people happy because. So think about what life was like under Cromwell and then think about what life was like under King Charles II and compare them. You must justify your answer with specific evidence. You must think about why that particular thing that King Charles II did would have made people happy. Okay, so for this task, you might be able to say something like, one reason people were happy for the restoration of King Charles II as monarch of England is that he reopens theatres and playhouses. So obviously without modern technology, so without gaming, things like Twitter, Facebook, social media, streaming services like Netflix, also, a lot of people weren't able to read at this point. The printing press was in the process of being invented, but literature hadn't necessarily reached everyone yet. And so things like theatre and plays were a big part of the entertainment that people would have. Back in the 1600s. And so when playhouses and theatres reopen again, it gives another big chunk of entertainment back to the people that was previously banned under Cromwell. Another reason why people were happy was because Charles reopened the taverns and pubs, which meant that aside from the drinking, yes, that might have been that would have been a massive positive for the English people, but also pubs are hugely social places as well. So it's not just about having a drink, but it's also being able to be there with other people in a crowd and be able to socialize with them. Which in these times of coronavirus, I think we can kind of empathize with. There are loads of other things you might be able to say as well. So, for example, he brought back Christmas. He basically just made entertainment thrive again. You were able to play sport. Word is that King Charles II was a massive fan of tennis. And also, any of these strict laws that Cromwell put into place during his rule as Lord Protector were repealed and got rid of. So those are a few things you could have written for this task here. So let's wrap up the content of this lesson then. So when King Charles II came to power, he exhumed Cromwell's corpse, got it out of the ground, and hung it as if he were a criminal. And he, despite saying that he would not punish people for what happened to his father, King Charles I, he immediately goes back on that by what he does to Cromwell's corpse. He gives a declaration called the Declaration of Breda, which he gives 5 promises. Things like religious freedom are on that declaration. Parliament, he says that he will keep Parliament, but again, the language is a little bit cagey. He says that he will keep Parliament. That doesn't necessarily mean that he needs to obey Parliament. He is the king, after all. But perhaps this is a new era for kings not having total control all the time and actually using Parliament for its intended purpose, such as an advisory board and as representatives of the people telling the king what the people themselves want. And this is an end of absolute monarchy, so the king having total power and instead having just some of the power. Religious freedom. So the main factions of Christianity, Protestants and Catholics, were both allowed to practice their own respective types of Christianity without fear of legal consequences, which might have happened under previous monarchs. Theatres reopened, giving the public more entertainment again. Taverns and pubs opened, which is great for the obvious reasons, but also the ability to socialise. Gambling was now legal again, so people could make money with card games, dice games, but indeed they could lose quite a lot of money as well, which might actually work against them, might actually make them more impoverished. And also, sport was brought back as another main figment of entertainment. Okay, so those are the key takeaways from today's lesson. Thank you, those of you for tuning in. You can find me again, same place, same time, for the next lesson in our sequence, all about King Charles and the New World. Thank you. I've been Mr. Windsor, and you will hear me again soon.